Dominick Giddings was born about 1826, in Virginia. He had one son from a previous relationship. He then married Mary Elizabeth Phelps and they had 7 children together. He then had one son with Mary Elizabeth. Dominick died on March 11, 1904, in Washington, District of Columbia, having lived a long life of 78 years, and was buried there. Dominick Giddings lived in Virginia in 1831, around the time Nat Turner and his fellow slaves launched a revolt against white settlers. His son Charles was born 1845, his daughter Elizabeth was born about 1847, his son John, James, was born about 1849, Alice was born in 1852 in. Dominick Giddings married Mary Elizabeth Phelps on January 26, 1855, in District of Columbia, when he was 29 years old. His son, William E., was born about 1859. Eliza A. was born in November 1863. Benjamin Dominick was born in January 1867. James Oliver was born about 1867. Dominick Giddings lived in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1880. Where his mentioned children were born during the humid summer of 1881, Dominick Giddings was living in Washington, District of Columbia when an assassin shot U.S. President James Garfield in the nation's capital. His son James Oliver passed away on July 6, 1883, at the age of 16. Dominick Giddings died on March 11, 1904, in Washington, District of Columbia, when he was 78 years old. Mary Elizabeth Phelps was born about 1829, in Maryland. She married Dominick Giddings on January 26, 1855, in District of Columbia, when she was 26 years old. When William E. Giddings was born about 1859, in District of Columbia, his father, Dominick, was 33 and his mother, Mary, was 30. He was married 3 times and had 5 sons and 3 daughters. He died on January 18, 1925, in District of Columbia, at the age of 66. William E.'s sister Eliza A. was born in November 1863 in Columbia when William E. was 4 years old. Towards the end of the American Civil War, William E. Giddings was living near Arlington, Virginia, when General Robert E. Lee's family farm was turned into the First National Military Cemetery. William E.'s brother Benjamin Dominick was born in January 1867 in Washington, District of Columbia when William E. was 8 years old. William E.'s brother James Oliver was born about 1867, in Washington, District of Columbia when William E. was 8 years old. William E.'s mother Mary Elizabeth passed away about 1869, at the age of 40. William E. Giddings married Laura Hart Ingham on January 13, 1882, in District of Columbia, when he was 23 years old. William E.'s brother James Oliver died on July 6, 1883, in District of Columbia when William E. was 24 years old. William E. Giddings married Lillian M. Giddings in 1892 when he was 33 years old. William E. Giddings married Lillian M. Giddings in 1892 in Washington, District of Columbia, when he was 33 years old. His son Elmer was born in April 1893 in District of Columbia. His son William E. was born about 1893, in District of Columbia. His son William E. was born about 1893, in District of Columbia. His daughter Twin was born on May 24, 1894, in District of Columbia. His daughter Irene E. was born about 1897, in District of Columbia. William E. Giddings lived in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1900. Had William E.'s father Dominick passed away on March 11, 1904, in Washington, District of Columbia, at the age of 78. His son Everett N. was born on October 20, 1907, in Washington, District of Columbia. His son Effort N. was born about 1908, in District of Columbia. William E. Giddings lived in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1910. William E. Giddings was living in Washington, District of Columbia in 1919, around the time when a nearby race riot sparked looting, arson, and murder. William E. Giddings lived in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1920. William E.'s brother Benjamin Dominick died on October 11, 1922, in Washington, District of Columbia when William E. was 63 years old. William E. Giddings died on January 18, 1925, in District of Columbia, when he was 66 years old. Lillian M. Giddings was born about 1871, in District of Columbia. She married William E. Giddings and they had 4 children together. She then married William Yuga on October 25, 1894, in Cuyahoga County, Ohio. She lived in Jacksonville, Florida in 1907. Lillian M. Giddings was born about 1871, in District of Columbia. During the humid summer of 1881, Lillian M. Giddings was probably living in District of Columbia when an assassin shot U.S. President James Garfield in the nation's capital. Lillian M. Giddings married William E. Giddings in 1892 in Washington, District of Columbia, when she was 21 years old. Her son William E. was born about 1893, in District of Columbia. Her daughter Twin was born on May 24, 1894, in District of Columbia. Lillian M. Giddings married William Yuga on October 25, 1894, in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, when she was 23 years old. Her daughter Irene E. was born about 1897, in District of Columbia. Lillian M. Giddings lived in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1900. Her son Everett N. was born on October 20, 1907, in Washington, District of Columbia. Lillian M. Giddings lived in Jacksonville, Florida, in 1907. Lillian M. Giddings lived in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1910. It's possible that Lillian M. Giddings, who lived in Washington, District of Columbia in 1913, witnessed the woman suffrage procession, which called for voting equality. Lillian M. Giddings lived in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1920. Death of daughter. Her daughter Irene E. passed away in December 1964 in Maryland, at the age of 67. Her son Everett N. passed away on October 28, 1983, in West Virginia, at the age of 76. When Everett N. Giddings was born on October 20, 1907, in Washington, District of Columbia, his father, William, was 48 and his mother, Lillian, was 36. He had one daughter with Barbara Ann Owens Craig on December 31, 1947. He died on October 28, 1983, in West Virginia, at the age of 76, and was buried in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Everett N. Giddings was born on October 20, 1907, in Washington, District of Columbia to Lillian M. Giddings, age 36, and William E. Giddings, age 48. Everett N. Giddings lived in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1910. Everett N. Giddings was living in Washington, District of Columbia in 1919, around the time when a nearby race riot sparked looting, arson, and murder. Everett N.'s father William E. passed away on January 18, 1925, in District of Columbia, at the age of 66. Everett N. Giddings was living in Washington, District of Columbia, when Charles Lindbergh visited their city after becoming the first man to make a solo flight across the Atlantic. Everett N. Giddings lived in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1932. Everett N. Giddings enlisted in the Army on June 10, 1943, in Fort Myer, Virginia, during World War II. He was 35 years old. His daughter Barbara M. was born on December 31, 1947, in Washington. Everett N.'s sister Irene E. died in December 1964 in Maryland when Everett N. was 57 years old. Everett N. Giddings died on October 28, 1983, in West Virginia, when he was 76 years old. When Arnold E. Tate was born on April 9, 1942, in Carroll County, Virginia, his mother, Jeanette, was 26. He had one son with Barbara M. Futch on May 22, 1966. Arnold E. died on May 20, 2005, in High Point, North Carolina, at the age of 63. The child of Arnold E. and Barbara M. Stephen Tate was born on May 22, 1966, in Cheverly, Maryland.